Jonathan Hale's house sat on the edge of a windswept hill, a place the locals jokingly called the Loner's Perch. The name suited him. For 35 years, no woman had entered his life, no family had lived within his walls, and no laughter had echoed through his rooms. The man himself was a quiet figure, broad-shouldered, silver at the temples, with eyes that gave nothing away. To the townsfolk below, he was a riddle wrapped in layers of silence. He had not always been this way. Once long ago, Jonathan had been known for his warmth. He had been a craftsman of rare skill, building furniture that seemed to breathe life into wood. Neighbors remembered the days when he delivered tables and chairs with a smile when he paused to help repair a fence or lift a heavy load. Back then, women had admired him, and he had admired them in return. But love, when it had finally come, had betrayed him in a way so sharp and merciless that he had withdrawn from everyone. The betrayal was whispered about, though no one knew the full truth. Some said a fiancé had run off with his best friend. Others claimed he had been left at the altar. The story varied depending on who was telling it, but the ending was always the same. Jonathan Hale had shut his heart as firmly as he shut the door of his home. As years turned to decades, people stopped asking about him. They simply grew used to his presence and absence. He still walked into town on rare occasions to buy supplies, flour, coffee, lamp oil, but he never lingered. His voice, when he spoke, was measured and polite, yet his eyes discouraged further conversation. The shopkeepers knew better than to pry. Children, curious and bold, sometimes dared each other to run up the hill and peek at his house. They returned with stories of curtains never drawn back, of a man working silently in his shed by lamplight, shaping wood long after midnight. He lived like a ghost among the living, haunting his own life, and yet Jonathan was not cruel. He never shouted, never chased anyone away. He simply did not invite connection. To those who tried to bridge the gap, his silence was answer enough. The rare neighbor who trudged up to deliver a holiday pie or a spare bundle of firewood was met with a nod, a quiet thank you, and a quick closing of the door. Inside, his home was tidy, but bare. A sturdy oak table, built by his own hands, sat in the kitchen. A single armchair faced the fireplace. Shelves of books lined the walls, though most were well-worn classics he had read many times. There were no family portraits, no mementos of shared life, only the steady hum of solitude. For Jonathan, this was safer. People brought pain. Silence did not. Still, even he could not escape the weight of time. Loneliness is a patient enemy. It does not strike all at once, but wears a man down slowly like water-carving stone. Some nights, as wind rattled the shutters, Jonathan felt the quiet pressing against him like an uninvited guest. He would rise, stoke the fire, and work with his tools until dawn, refusing to acknowledge the ache that lived beneath his ribs. The townsfolk below often wondered how he endured it. "A man can't live without love forever," one old farmer remarked. "It hollows you out." But Jonathan proved them wrong, at least on the surface. He survived by routine, by discipline, by refusing to glance too long at what might have been. And so the years slipped past, one much like the other. By the time Jonathan reached his mid-50s, he was a figure of myth as much as of flesh. No woman's touched his heart in 35 years, they said, and none ever will. But fate does not always honor the walls men build around themselves. For all his careful isolation, for all the quiet rituals that kept him apart, Jonathan's life was about to shift. And it would not be by his own choosing, but by a single knock at his door on the stormiest night of autumn. The storm had been building all afternoon, though Jonathan hardly noticed at first. He was in his workshop, the shed that clung stubbornly to the side of his house like an extension of his own frame. There, the scent of fresh-cut cedar and the steady rhythm of tools shielded him from the world. He worked on a chair leg, smoothing the curve with careful precision. To him, time meant little in this space. Hours passed unnoticed, marked only by the deepening shadows at the edges of the room by evening. However, even Jonathan could not ignore the way the air shifted. The wind that had whispered across the hill all day now spoke with a harder edge, rattling the loose tin of the shed roof. Leaves scattered like frantic birds, skittering across the ground. He paused, ran a calloused hand along the finished wood, and exhaled. A craftsman knew when to stop. Storms and sharp tools did not mix. Stepping outside, he lifted his face to the sky. Low, bruised clouds rolled heavy over the horizon, their underbellies swollen with rain. The air smelled of iron and earth, the unmistakable promise of a storm about to break. Jonathan tugged his coat tighter and made his way into the house. The old door groaned on its hinges, protesting the sudden gusts. Inside, he struck a match and lit the lamps one by one, their warm glow pushing back the gloom. The fire in the hearth was coaxed to life, flames snapping eagerly at the dry kindling. Jonathan moved with the efficiency of long practice, securing the shutters, checking the latch on the cellar, laying extra logs by the fire. Storms were nothing new to him. On this hill, they were part of the rhythm of the seasons. He respected their power but did not fear them. By nightfall, the storm arrived in full. Rain hurled itself against the windows, relentless and cold, while thunder cracked so sharply it seemed to split the air in two. The wind keened around the house, finding every gap, every seam. Jonathan sat in his armchair by the fire, a mug of coffee warming his hands, and listened. For most men, such a night might have stirred unease. But Jonathan was accustomed to weathering both storms of sky and storms of spirit. Solitude had taught him endurance. The storm outside was only noise loud, yes, but distant from the silence he carried within, and yet he could not help but notice how deeply the house groaned, how fiercely the wind pressed against the walls. In his youth, storms had been thrilling, a reminder of nature's wildness, of how small men were against its fury. Now they served only as a mirror, reflecting his own stubbornness. Just as the house stood against the tempest, so too did he stand against life's insistence that he open himself again. Lightning flashed, and for a moment the room was painted in stark white, every shadow thrown into sharp relief. Jonathan's face, lined and weathered, looked almost carved in stone. He took another sip of coffee and set the mug aside. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks upward. Hours dragged slowly, measured by the storm's fury. At times, Jonathan let himself drift into thought. He wondered if the town below had lost power, if the old oak by the churchyard had survived another gale, if children were huddled under quilts, their mothers whispering reassurances against the thunder. These thoughts flickered like sparks in his mind, quickly extinguished before they could ignite into longing. It was close to midnight when the power finally failed. The lamps went dark, leaving only the fire's glow to push against the black. Jonathan did not curse or fumble. He simply adjusted as he always had. The storm would run its course. The morning would come. Life would continue in its steady, predictable way, or so he thought, because on that night, as the rain lashed harder and the wind howled louder, something unexpected stirred beyond the storm. Something, or rather, someone was about to intrude on the quiet rhythm of his life. He did not yet know it, but fate was climbing the hill in soaked boots, her path lit only by lightning. And before the hour was over, Jonathan Hale's door would feel a knock that would change the next 35 years of silence in an instant. Jonathan had just settled deeper into his armchair when the storm reached its peak. The rain battered the windows in sheets, and the wind howled like a chorus of wolves. The fire, though steady, seemed small against the wildness outside. He leaned forward to place another log on the flames, the orange light flickering across his hands. The rhythm of crackling wood was almost enough to lull him into that half-sleep of a man who has trained himself to ignore the world. And then, it came. At first, he thought it was the storm itself, some loose shutter, some broken branch striking against the house. But the sound came again, distinct and deliberate. 3 sharp knocks, heavy and urgent, echoing through the wooden door. Jonathan froze. No one knocked on his door. Not at night, not in the storm, not in 35 years. He held still as though silence could erase what he had heard. But the sound came again, this time louder, desperate, insistent. Rising slowly, he set down the iron poker and crossed the room. His steps were cautious, his breath held tight in his chest. The door shuddered under the force of the wind, but beneath it he could hear a voice, faint, trembling, calling out, "Please, please, someone." His hand hovered over the latch. A lifetime of solitude had trained him to turn away from intrusion, to keep the world at a distance. But he could not mistake the sound of fear in that voice, nor the human need behind it. With a swift motion, he drew back the latch and pulled open the door. The storm roared inside immediately, whipping rain across the floor and extinguishing the lamp nearest the entry. But amid the chaos stood a figure, a woman, drenched to the bone, her hair plastered to her cheeks, her eyes wide with exhaustion and fright. "Please," she gasped, shivering violently. "My car. It stopped. I didn't know where else to go." Jonathan stared at her. In the firelight behind him, her features were pale, drawn, yet striking in their vulnerability. Her coat clung to her frame, soaked through, and mud streaked the hem of her skirt. She looked as though she had been wandering the storm for hours. For a heartbeat too long, he did nothing. His old instinct screamed to shut the door, to preserve his silence. But her voice wavered again, breaking through his walls. "I just need somewhere dry, just until morning." Without another word, Jonathan stepped aside. "Come in," he said, his voice rough from disuse. The woman stumbled past him, nearly collapsing onto the braided rug by the fire. He shut the door quickly, leaning his weight against it until the latch held firm against the wind. The storm was locked outside again, but the silence within the house had changed. He turned toward her, unsure what to do next. She was bent forward, hugging her arms around herself, her teeth chattering uncontrollably. Water pooled at her feet. Jonathan moved without thinking, fetching a wool blanket from the back of his chair and draping it around her shoulders. She murmured something like thanks, her voice hoarse. "Sit closer to the fire," he said, gesturing. She obeyed, sinking down into the chair opposite his. For several long moments, the only sounds were the fire's steady crackle and her uneven breathing. Jonathan studied her carefully, wary but curious. She was not young, perhaps in her early 40s, he guessed, but there was a quiet dignity about her, even in her disarray. Finally, she lifted her eyes to his. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean to trouble you." I'm Clara," Jonathan nodded, his expression unreadable. "Jonathan," he replied simply. She gave a faint, trembling smile, as though the exchange of names alone was an anchor against the storm. Then her gaze flicked toward the door, as if afraid the storm might yet swallow her again. Jonathan leaned back, folding his arms. He had not expected company, not tonight, not ever. Yet here she was, a stranger carried by wind and chance to his doorstep. And though he told himself he would offer her nothing more than shelter until morning, something in the way her voice had cracked on that desperate please still echoed in his chest. For the first time in decades, Jonathan Halley was not alone in his house, and he did not know whether to feel alarmed or strangely relieved. Clara's shivering began to ease under the weight of the blanket and the steady warmth of the fire, though her lips still trembled faintly as she tried to speak. Jonathan sat opposite her, his broad shoulders casting a long shadow across the wall, his expression a mixture of suspicion and restraint. It had been so many years since another soul had shared this room that he hardly knew what to do with the space between them. Clara clutched the blanket tighter, as if afraid it might slip away along with her last reserves of strength. She looked into the fire rather than at him, her words coming haltingly, each one pulled from her as if from some heavy weight. "My car broke down," she began. "Just a mile back, maybe less. The engine died, and when I tried to start it again, nothing but silence. I thought if I walked, I might find a house or a gas station. But the rain, it was like walking into a wall. Then I saw your light." She turned her head toward him at last, her eyes reflecting both exhaustion and gratitude. "You were the only light on the hill." Jonathan said nothing at first. He studied her face, the delicate lines of weariness, the glisten of rain still clinging to her lashes. She was no stranger to hardship. He could see that. He set his jaw and finally spoke, his tone even but distant. "You shouldn't have been out in this weather. It's a miracle you made it up here at all." She gave a soft, humorless laugh. A miracle or desperation, maybe both. The words hung between them, edged with something more than the storm outside. Jonathan shifted in his chair, uncomfortable. With the sound of another voice in his home, but unable to deny the truth in hers. Silence stretched, broken only by the occasional crack of thunder. Clara's gaze fell to the fire again, her voice quieter now. "My husband used to handle things like this," she murmured, almost to herself. "The car, the storms, the plans. He always knew what to do." Her throat tightened. She pressed her lips together before continuing. "But he's been gone 3 years now. And no matter how much time passes, nights like this remind me how much harder everything is without him." Jonathan felt a slow stirring in his chest, a tug against the fortress he had built around his heart. He should have looked away, should have left her words unanswered, but her grief was laid bare in a way that was impossible to ignore. "You're a widow," he said, not as a question but as a recognition. Clara nodded, eyes glistening though no tears fell. "Yes, a widow. And sometimes, when the world closes in like it did tonight, I feel it all over again as though I've lost him yesterday. You'd think grief would grow lighter, but some days it still feels like carrying a stone uphill." She gave a fragile smile. "I didn't mean to bring that here to your home. I only needed a place to keep dry until morning." Jonathan's fingers tapped once against the arm of his chair. He wanted to retreat into silence, the way he always had, to give nothing and reveal nothing. Yet something in her voice, raw, unpolished, unguarded, pulled at him. She was not asking for sympathy, only acknowledging the burden she carried. "You're safe here," he said finally, his voice low, almost reluctant. "The storm will pass by morning. You can stay until then." Relief flickered in her eyes, though it was tempered with humility. "Thank you," she whispered. For a moment neither spoke. Jonathan watched the fire, though his thoughts were anything but steady. In 35 years, no woman had entered his house, let alone sat across from him speaking of loss. He had locked his heart against such confessions long ago, yet tonight a stranger's plea had breached the walls. Clara leaned back in her chair, pulling the blanket tighter. Her shoulders loosened, her breathing slowed. The firelight softened her tired features, and Jonathan saw not only grief but resilience, the fragile kind born of survival. She closed her eyes briefly, whispering as if only to herself, "Sometimes all you need is a door that opens." Jonathan's jaw tightened at the words. They echoed in him, uncomfortably close to truths he had buried for decades. A door that opens. He had kept his closed for so long, and yet tonight, without knowing why, he had opened it, and because of that single act, his life would never again return to what it was. The fire had burned down to a steady glow, filling the room with a warmth that neither Jonathan nor Clara spoke of, but both felt. Outside, the storm still raged, rain pelting the roof like gravel, wind screeching across the chimney, but inside the little house, a fragile stillness had taken root. Clara sat curled in the armchair, wrapped in Jonathan's wool blanket, her damp hair now drying into loose waves around her face. Her eyes followed the fire as though it were telling her a story she'd long forgotten. Jonathan, in his usual chair, sat upright, hands resting on his knees, as if posture alone could keep the moment at a safe distance. He had not had a guest in 35 years, yet here he was, a stranger just a few feet away, her presence disrupting the silence that had once been his only companion. Clara broke it first. "You built this chair, didn't you?" she asked softly, running her hand along the smooth wooden armrest of the seat she occupied. Jonathan blinked, surprised by the question. "Yes. It's beautiful," she said simply. "Strong, but gentle in its lines. My husband," she hesitated, steadying herself, "he used to carve. Nothing this fine, just little things. Birds, mostly. I loved watching his hands when he worked. There's something peaceful about a person who knows how to shape wood." Jonathan's gaze flicked to her, then away. Compliments unsettled him. Praise opened doors to further talk, further knowing. Yet he found himself answering, "It takes patience and time. Two things most people don't have much of anymore." Clara smiled faintly. "Patience I've been forced to learn. Time," she sighed, looking into the flames. "Time I've had more of than I wanted." Jonathan shifted in his chair. He wasn't used to conversations that leaned into such truths. People in town always spoke to him with politeness, never with intimacy. And here was this woman, dripping from the storm, speaking as though she'd known him for years. Still, he listened. For reasons he could not name, he wanted to hear her voice. "I used to think," Clara continued, her words slow, deliberate, "that after my husband passed, someone would step in. Friends, neighbors, even family. And they did for a while. But grief, it makes people uncomfortable. After a few months, they drift away. You find yourself alone more often than not. And then one day, you wake up and realize you've forgotten the sound of someone else moving around your house." Jonathan's chest tightened. He knew that silence well, though his was self-chosen. He had made a fortress out of it, while hers had been forced upon her. Two different paths leading to the same lonely clearing. He cleared his throat. "Solitude isn't the worst fate." Clara looked at him, her eyes searching. "No, but it isn't living either." Her words cut sharper than he expected. For years he had told himself that solitude was safer, even noble, that he was beyond the foolishness of love, beyond the risks of pain. Yet hearing it from her lips, the stark difference between surviving and living felt like a blow he had not braced for. The storm bellowed again outside, rattling the shutters. Clara pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. Jonathan stood abruptly, half to distract himself, half to give her comfort. "You should have something warm," he muttered, moving toward the kitchen. "Tea or coffee?" "Tea would be lovely," she said. In the kitchen, Jonathan busied himself with the kettle, his movements precise, almost military. But his thoughts betrayed him. He could not recall the last time he had prepared a cup for anyone but himself. The clink of porcelain felt louder than it should, the act of pouring water strangely intimate. When he returned, Clara accepted the cup with both hands, inhaling the steam as though it were a balm. "Thank you," she murmured. Jonathan sat again, watching her sip. The sight stirred something unfamiliar, an ache, yes, but also a warmth he had forgotten he was capable of feeling. Two lonely souls, drawn together by a storm neither had asked for. He had spent 35 years fortifying his heart against intrusion, yet in a single night this widow had stepped through the cracks without even trying. And Jonathan, though he would not admit it aloud, did not entirely want her to leave. For the first time in decades, his solitude did not feel like protection. It felt like something being slowly undone. The night wore on, though neither Jonathan nor Clara seemed eager for sleep. The storm outside remained fierce, but inside the small house, a gentler current moved between them. It was not comfort exactly. Jonathan was far from comfortable, but it was something unfamiliar, a kind of quiet pull that unsettled his rigid stillness. Clara set her teacup down on the small table beside her chair. The firelight painted her face in golden shadow, softening the lines of sorrow etched there. She seemed calmer now, though her eyes held a depth of weariness that spoke of more storms than the one raging outside. "You live here alone?" she asked, her tone careful, as though aware she was stepping into private ground. Jonathan nodded. "Once. 35 years?" Her brows lifted slightly. "That long?" "Long enough," he replied, his voice low as if warning her not to dig further. But Clara didn't retreat. Instead, she tilted her head, her gaze steady. "Why so long?" Jonathan stiffened. Few dared to ask him questions like that. Most in town skirted around his solitude, treating it as some permanent scar. But Clara this stranger wrapped in. His blanket looked at him with unflinching curiosity, not malice. "Some doors," he said slowly, "once closed, are better left shut." Clara studied him, her lips pressing together thoughtfully. "Or maybe," she countered gently, "they're only waiting for the right person to knock." Jonathan's chest tightened. The words echoed uncomfortably close to what she had whispered earlier about doors that open. He turned his gaze back to the fire, unwilling to let her see the flicker of something raw in his expression. Clara leaned back, her voice softer now. "Forgive me, I don't mean to pry. It's just, people aren't meant to carry so many years alone." Jonathan's jaw clenched. He wanted to argue, to remind her that solitude had been his choice, that he had endured it just fine. But the truth pressed against him in ways he could no longer deny. He had survived, yes, but had he lived? Clara's presence made the distinction painfully clear. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken things. Clara, perhaps sensing his struggle, shifted the conversation. She told him about the little house she'd kept after her husband died, about her garden that flourished one season and failed the next, about the way she sometimes sat at the kitchen table in the evening, listening to the tick of the clock and pretending it was another heartbeat in the room. Her words painted pictures simple, ordinary yet achingly tender. Jonathan found himself listening intently, his hands still, his breathing quieter. The cadence of her voice stirred something in him he thought had long since withered, a desire not just to hear words, but to know the soul behind them. And then, unexpectedly, Clara laughed. It was not a loud laugh, but a soft ripple, warm and alive. She had recalled a memory of her husband's failed attempt at fixing their roof, how he'd ended up tumbling into a rain barrel and insisted he meant to do it all along. The laughter, fragile though it was, carried through the room like sunlight piercing storm clouds. Jonathan's lips twitched. For a man who had not smiled in years, it felt strange, almost foreign, but he could not help it. Her laughter was disarming, loosening the armor he had worn so long, Clara noticed. Her eyes softened, and for a brief moment, they simply looked at each other, two people bound by different griefs, yet meeting in the same quiet place of longing. Jonathan cleared his throat and rose abruptly, as though movement might help him regain control. He busied himself by adjusting the fire, though it needed no tending. His hands, steady on tools and timber, betrayed the faintest tremor. He had spent decades perfecting the art of distance. And yet, in the span of one night, this woman's presence, her grief, her laughter, had found the cracks in his walls. When he finally sat again, Clara was watching him not with pity, not with judgment, but with a kind of gentle recognition. It was the look of someone who understood what it meant to be broken and still breathing. Jonathan turned away, but the truth remained. The fortress he had built around his heart was faltering, and for the first time in 35 years, he wasn't entirely certain he wanted to rebuild it. The storm gave its last roar just before dawn. By the time Jonathan stirred in his chair, the world beyond the shutters was quiet again, wrapped in the heavy stillness that always follows a night of rage. The rain had washed the air clean, and faint light was beginning to seep into the edges of the sky. Jonathan blinked himself awake. He had not meant to sleep, but the fire's steady warmth and the lateness of the hour had caught him off guard. His neck ached from the awkward angle, and when he shifted, the wool blanket slid from his shoulder. He glanced across the room. Clara was still there. She had drifted off in the opposite chair, curled beneath the blanket he had given her, her head resting against the worn wooden arm. In sleep, she looked softer, younger almost, though the faint shadows under her eyes told of long nights spent battling her own storms. Her breathing was even, her chest rising and falling with a kind of peace that had clearly been rare in her recent years. Jonathan studied her longer than he meant to. It felt intrusive, wrong, yet he could not look away. In the pale light of morning, she was no longer just a stranger caught in the rain. She was a widow who had carried her grief up the hill, a woman who had knocked on his door and unknowingly on the gates of his heart. He rose quietly, careful not to wake her, and set about rekindling the fire. The embers responded easily, flaring into fresh flame. He boiled water, set out the last of his bread and a jar of honey, movements automatic but slower than usual. His mind was elsewhere, circling the fact that, for the first time in 35 years, he was preparing a morning not for himself alone. Clara stirred as the kettle whistled. She sat up, brushing a hand across her eyes, and blinked at him. For a moment, she looked confused, as though unsure of where she was. Then memory returned, and she pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "Good morning, Jonathan," said, his voice rough but steady. She offered a small smile. "Good morning. The storm. It's over?" He nodded. "Cleared out before sunrise. Roads will be muddy, but passable soon enough." She glanced toward the door, hesitation flickering across her face. Then she turned back to him. "I should be going, once it's light enough. I've already imposed too much." Jonathan set the bread on the table. It was no imposition. The words surprised him, though they were true. Clara's smile deepened, though it carried a trace of sadness. "Still, I can't stay. People like us, we learn not to linger where we don't belong." Something in Jonathan tightened. He wanted to agree, to let her go, to preserve the order of his solitude. Yet another part of him, the part she had unknowingly stirred, rebelled against the thought. He masked it with silence, pouring tea into 2 mugs. They ate together at the table, the first shared meal Jonathan had known in decades. The bread was plain, the honey simple, but Clara's gratitude made it feel like a feast. She told him about her small garden again, how the roses had stubbornly survived last winter. He listened, nodding, his responses quiet but genuine. When she finished eating, she set the mug down and looked at him directly. "Thank you for opening the door last night, for the fire, for listening." Jonathan met her gaze, his throat tight. He wanted to say something, anything that might hint at what her presence had done to him. But years of silence weighed heavily, and the words would not form. All he managed was a nod. Clara stood, folding the blanket carefully and laying it over the back of the chair. She reached for her coat, still damp but wearable, and slipped it on with quiet determination. The sight unsettled him more than he expected. At the door, she paused, her hand on the latch. Perhaps I'll see you again someday," she said softly. Her voice carried no expectation, only the fragile hope of someone who knew how quickly the world could close in. Jonathan's reply came before he could think. "You will." The words hung in the air, surprising them both. Clara's eyes warmed with something unspoken, and for a heartbeat, the silence between them felt like an agreement. Then she opened the door. The morning light spilled in, cool and silver, carrying the scent of wet earth. Clara stepped into it, her figure small against the vast sky. Jonathan watched her walk down the muddy path, his chest heavy, his hands useless at his sides. The storm had passed, but within him something new had only just begun. Jonathan stood at the doorway long after Clara had disappeared down the hill. The morning air was crisp and sharp, carrying the damp scent of rain-soaked earth. The sky was washed clean, streaked with pale sunlight breaking through the last tattered remnants of cloud. It should have felt like every other morning after a storm, ordinary and predictable. But nothing felt ordinary anymore. He closed the door, leaned against it, and let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The house was quiet again, too quiet. The chair where Clara had sat stood empty, the blanket folded neatly across its back. The fire still glowed, but it no longer felt like warmth, it felt like reminder. For 35 years, Jonathan had told himself he needed nothing but wood and tools, silence and routine. He had believed that solitude kept him safe, that distance from others kept his heart intact. But now he knew the truth. It wasn't safety he had lived in, it was exile. And in one stormy night, Clara had shown him what it meant to step out of it. He spent the morning as he always did, stacking wood, tending the fire, moving through the motions of a life built on habit. But every sound seemed sharper, every corner of the house emptier. The chair across from his no longer looked like furniture. It looked like absence. He found himself glancing toward the window, wondering if she might appear again, though he knew it was unlikely. By afternoon, he could bear the silence no longer. He cleaned the cups they had used, his hands lingering on the porcelain as though it held some imprint of her presence. He traced the rim of the mug she had held, then set it back on the shelf. A foolish act, perhaps, but it made him feel less as though the night had been a dream. The days that followed were both ordinary and different. He worked, he ate, he read by the fire, but beneath it all ran a new current, expectation. For the first time in decades, he found himself listening for footsteps on the path, glancing toward the road when he went into town, lingering a little longer at the market. The townsfolk noticed something, though they couldn't name it. He seemed less distant, his eyes not so clouded. Some even claimed they saw him smile, though none could say what caused it. It was nearly 2 weeks later when Clara returned. The knock came in the late afternoon, softer than the desperate pounding of that stormy night, but Jonathan recognized it instantly. He opened the door without hesitation. She stood there in the pale light, not drenched this time, but with the same quiet strength in her eyes. She held a basket in her hands, bread, apples, a jar of preserves. "I thought," she said, her voice a little tentative, "perhaps I owed you a visit under kinder skies." Jonathan stepped aside. "Come in." Her smile widened, and she crossed the threshold as though it were the most natural thing in the world. The house seemed to breathe differently with her inside. They shared the bread at the table, spoke of small things, gardens, storms, the stubbornness of old cars, but beneath every word lay something unspoken, a recognition that they had already crossed some unseen line. In the weeks that followed, visits became regular. Sometimes she came with a basket, sometimes with nothing but her presence. Sometimes he walked down the hill to her little house, where roses struggled against the fence and the air carried the scent of earth and growing things. They spoke often, but they also sat in comfortable silence, two people who understood the weight of quiet but no longer feared it. Jonathan felt the cracks in his walls widen, not with the violence of collapse but with the gentleness of ivy finding its way through stone. Clara did not demand his heart. She simply stood beside him until he remembered he still had one to give. One evening, as they sat by the fire once more, Clara turned to him and said softly, "You know, I thought storms only took things away, but that night it gave me something back." Jonathan looked at her, the flicker of firelight in her eyes, and felt a warmth deeper than any flame. "Me too," he said, and in that moment, 35. Years of silence finally surrendered. Not to noise, but to companionship. Not to a crowd, but to one woman, the widow who had knocked at his door in the storm and, without force, touched the heart he thought was lost forever. It was not an ending, but a beginning. A life rebuilt not from wood and stone, but from laughter, trust, and the simple miracle of a door that had opened when it mattered most.